So I want to talk to you a little bit about dismissive avoidance and why they tend to flaw find in relationships, and also what is the underlying root cause of why this is taking place, and how we can actually move the needle on both understanding this if we're on the receiving end of it, or actually creating change if you are the person doing it. So, dismissive avoidance, as a general rule, develop one of their first and most major coping mechanisms at a very young age. This coping mechanism is the coping mechanism of avoidance. So, what you'll see as a general rule is because dismissive avoidants are not getting their needs met in childhood, they become the attachment style or love style who tries to avoid things, right? Their coping mechanism is to avoid attaching too deeply to people, to minimize their need for attachment based connection as a way of protecting themselves and not getting hurt. And I just recently put like a whole other YouTube series on about this, about arrested development. And I'm not going to go into it too much in this video, but it is kind of relevant, which is that wherever we have these coping mechanisms and they like go around, this underlying fear or pain point that we have. So in this case for dismissive avoidance, this like assumption that even if they were to communicate their needs, because usually in the DA's childhood, they actually tried to communicate and express themselves in ways that children do know how to do, and it didn't get their needs met. So they formed this like coping mechanism to just minimize even needing anything from caregivers as a way of staying safe and as a way of self-protecting. But when we have a coping mechanism around something, it sort of forms the shell around it that prevents us from actually growing through the pain point or problem that pre-exists there and sits beneath the surface. And as a result of that, what essentially takes place is that what age we develop that coping mechanism at. So when dismissive avoidants start developing their coping mechanism of avoiding things to try to feel better or create relief for themselves, it's usually a very young age that they develop this. And where we develop that coping mechanism, wherever we have a hard outer shell around something, we can't evolve and grow at the same time as we are coping, because coping is this automatic subconscious response. Growth always involves like being consciously aware of something or introspecting or reflecting and then working to change the pattern of behavior from a different strategy, a different unique perspective than what we're used to doing from this automatic space that we've been doing things from over here. So what you'll see is that for dismissive avoidance, where they have this avoidance strategy, we tend to actually be expressing the emotional age at which we develop that coping mechanism. So for dismissive avoidance, they're kind of in this space of arrested development. And again, deeper dive on other videos where we kind of essentially what it means is like you grow up physically, but certain places you can remain very emotionally stagnant. And for dismissive avoidance, they tend to very much have this around avoidance. And so they do this to stay safe and they avoid things, but then it leads to them not having conversations, not thinking that they can get their needs met from a partner, assuming that their needs will just be neglected, even if they did express them. And what this then leads to is a complete avoidance of crucial conversations. Now, I really want to state here that this is not just for dismissive avoidance, this is for everybody. Part of individuating as an adult, part of evolving and actually becoming, having a strong inner sense of self involves being able to individuate. It involves being able to do hard things like have hard conversations about our needs, learning our own boundaries and personal domain, to stopping this endless deriving of, our own personal opinions as just being like whatever the collective opinions are, and not getting our sense of stability and security from the outside in, but instead learning to derive our sense of stability and security from the inside out, from understanding ourselves, our own needs, our own boundaries, our own ability to emotionally regulate. And once we've individuated in that healthy way and understood those things, then being able to go bring those things out into the world and into our relationships. And without that first part, it's really hard to get to the second part. And for dismissive avoidance specifically, what ends up taking place is they avoid having crucial conversations. They avoid thinking that they can get their needs met. They avoid digging into themselves and introspecting in many ways. Again, not necessarily across the boards, but in many ways, especially emotionally, this can happen for dismissive avoidance. And so what this leads to them doing is not feeling strong and empowered and having tough discussions. And having tough discussions is an adult part of life. We have to be able to communicate about our boundaries to feel safe and protected in the world. We have to share our needs in interpersonal relationships. Like, we have to get good and we have to normalize having tough and vulnerable conversations. But because DAs are coping and they have this hard outer shell where they've developed this coping mechanism of just going directly into avoidance, and because it's been there for so long, what ends up taking place is they have very weak muscles of having crucial conversations. So then what happens next is that if I don't know how to talk through things, if I assume that I shouldn't bother talking to you because my needs aren't going to get met anyways. And if I just avoid in order to self-regulate and to kind of like deal with how I feel instead of, talking with you or communicating with people in my life, then eventually, because I'm avoiding crucial conversations, I think I have to find the perfect partner who has no flaws, no mistakes, no differences from myself, that we get along perfectly 24/7 all the time in order to settle down in a relationship, in order to be okay being in that person's company and making a commitment to them across time. And the reality is that, the dismissive avoidant is essentially using that concept or idea of the perfect partner as a subconscious strategy, as another avoidance mechanism, right? It's like, oh, if I just avoid, um, you know, finding somebody with any flaws, then I'll be okay. But we have to, that's like a call for individuation, because we don't get what we're looking for there from our outside world. We get it through navigating our inside world, learning how to have tough discussions and emotionally relate to each other and express empathy and talk about needs. We learn how to connect and solve for that problem of other people having flaws by learning to talk about those flaws in a healthy way, learning to navigate our differences in a healthy way through communication, through vulnerability. But when a dismissive avoidant is so busy avoiding those things because that's their historic way of knowing how to cope, it really stunts their growth. And thus, they will flaw-find and pick apart partners as a means of creating distance to go back into that original coping mechanism they developed, that again just represents a form of arrested development that they're experiencing. And so, the way out, and here's the other reality, by the way, is that there will never be a perfect partner. There will be people that are highly compatible, that you really click with, that like are an amazing, amazing person for you, but there will always be differences in relationships. There's no exception to that. And part of why friction will always occur when we have two people coming together is that you have different internal realities. And when there's a coming together and a formation of an attachment bond, you're actually merging these two different internal realities together, and you're trying to make them make sense so that you can have this sort of joined reality and perspective where you have an interdependent relationship, taking each other into consideration. And so part of that merging actually involves the necessary friction that's going to take place. It's just inevitable in that experience. And when we go through things like the power struggle stage, we're really letting somebody into our internal reality and vice versa. But you cannot do that effectively and healthily and smoothly, that in a way that leads to positive outcomes, without first being able to have tough dialogues in a healthy way. And getting good at that is of the utmost importance. So again, what you'll see is dismissive avoidance, avoiding crucial conversations, not knowing how to have them because they don't know their own needs, they're not communicating them, and they Flaw-Find as a measure of self-protection, and a further avoidance mechanism to not have to have tough conversations. So if this is you or your loved one, um, you want to get good at communicating. If you want to have a securely attached relationship in general, you have to get good at communicating, point blank, period. If that's a skill that you haven't learned yet, it's totally okay. We really don't get a lot of healthy modeling for this growing up. But it is one of the most important life lessons on our path to individuation, right? On our path to becoming a whole self. And so if you want to do a deeper dive, I have a whole course all about communication. It's called the Conflict Communication Course. It gives you really simple steps and measures to follow communication patterns in a healthy way and to relearn like how to do communication properly. And what that will lead to, honestly, is you being able to learn how to navigate tough circumstances in a way that doesn't make you afraid. So I know for me, for example, before I really learned how to have tough conversations, and tough conversations happen everywhere, right? They happen with friendships, family relationships, romantic relationships, work relationships, like you name it. It's a necessity to excel in life. Prior to having tough conversations and being good at it and being okay with it, and it doesn't mean I'm perfect by any means, but like definitely did a lot of practicing there over the years. Prior to that, I would just feel unseen by people in my life or not understood or feel like I can't set a boundary and I can't state a need. And so then I couldn't get it met and I would feel unfulfilled in the relationships in my life. But as I learned to do this effectively, as I learned to practice this and then normalize it, so it wasn't on this huge pedestal as this big scary thing, but instead it was like, oh, a tough conversation I have to have. Okay, I've done that a million times, no problem. And it doesn't feel scary or so big anymore. What that leads to is more connection in relationships, a better foundation, feeling more understood, feeling more seen, feeling safer in your world on a daily basis because you know that you can set boundaries as needed. Also, not fearing conflict so much because you know that conflict is a solvable problem. Like, there's so many things that are important. So I feel like I'm kind of like rambling about this, but I just want to state how valuable this is and how valuable of a life skill this is. And it also tends to be one of the things that dismissive avoidants struggle with the absolute most. And again, it's not your fault if you're listening to this as a DA. It is your responsibility in your adult life. But it's not your fault that these things happened and that you had potentially poor emotional modeling around these things to begin with. So, with that being said, if you want to do a much deeper dive, you can check out for free for 7 days our conflict communication course. I also have other videos on this channel where we talk about that. Just the course will help you really get to exactly where you need to be in a much shorter period of time with very clear, specific steps. You can absolutely complete that course in less than 7 days. It's like an hour and a half long. You can do it in a sitting, and it will give you the breakthroughs you need to learn the skills to master having tough conversations and not feeling like conflict has to be this big, scary thing. So I hope this makes sense. Thank you so much for watching. Thank you for being here. If you enjoyed this video and enjoy this channel, please consider subscribing. I literally put out daily videos so you can have daily breakthroughs in regards to your subconscious mind, your life, your relationships, your attachment style, and your different patterns, and how they can really show up and manifest in our adult lives. So I hope you enjoyed this. Thank you for watching and see you in future videos.